There are some stories a man carries with him until his hair turns white and his hands grow too stiff to hold a cup without trembling. They are not always stories of great battles or famous men, nor are they stories that ever found their way into newspapers. Some are simply stories about two lonely people who happened to cross paths when the world had given them every reason to stop believing in kindness. This is one of those stories. It happened in the autumn of 1887, in a quiet corner of Wyoming Territory where the plains stretched so far beneath the pale western sky that a man could ride for half a day without seeing another roof. Back then, the land had a way of making people honest. There was nowhere to hide from the wind, the cold, or the silence. And sometimes there was nowhere to hide from your own heart either. Quinn had once believed that a home was a place where a woman was safe. She had been wrong. She was 27 years old when the last door was shut behind her. The house she had once called home stood at the edge of a growing frontier settlement, a fine two-story place with white-trimmed windows, a wide porch, and enough land around it to make people think its owner was a respectable man. From the outside, it looked like the sort of house where a woman might grow old beside a loving husband. But houses can lie. The man who owned it had been Quinn's husband for nearly 4 years. In the beginning, he had spoken softly to her. He had promised her a warm home, a good life, and a future that would never leave her wanting. Quinn had believed him because she had been young enough to believe that a man's promises meant something. Over time, his kindness disappeared. His temper grew. His words became sharper. And eventually, even the sound of his boots crossing the floor was enough to make Quinn's heart begin to race. She learned to walk quietly. She learned to speak carefully. She learned that sometimes the safest answer was no answer at all. There are wounds a person can see, and then there are wounds that hide beneath a woman's skin. Quinn carried both. That afternoon, the sky had been gray when her husband threw her small leather bag onto the porch. She had not understood what was happening at first. She stood in the doorway, one hand pressed against the frame. Her husband would not look at her. "You heard me," he said. Quinn stared at him. "But this is my home." The man laughed without humor. "Not anymore." She looked down at herself. Her dress was old, though carefully mended. Her auburn-brown hair had come loose around her shoulders. There was a fading bruise near her wrist and another hidden beneath the collar of her dress. Her face, despite exhaustion, still possessed the kind of beauty that made strangers look twice. Nature had been generous with Quinn, perhaps too generous. She had clear skin, expressive gray-blue eyes, long dark lashes, and a softness in her features that made her appear younger than her years. But beauty had never protected her. If anything, it had made her suffering harder to understand. Her husband looked at her as though she were an inconvenience. "You have until sundown to get off my property." Quinn's lips parted. "Where am I supposed to go?" He shrugged. "That isn't my concern." There are moments when a person's heart breaks so quietly that nobody hears it. That was one of them. Quinn picked up her bag. She waited for him to change his mind. He did not. She waited for him to apologize. He did not. She waited for even one small sign that the man she had once loved still remembered the woman who had stood beside him through 4 difficult winters. There was nothing. The door closed. Quinn remained on the porch for several seconds. Then she stepped down into the cold. She walked. She did not know where she was going. The settlement was beginning to quiet as evening approached. Shopkeepers were closing their doors. Horses stamped their hooves against the cold earth. Smoke rose from chimneys, carrying the smell of supper into the evening air. Quinn walked past all of it. Nobody knew that she had nowhere to sleep. Nobody knew that the bag in her hand contained almost everything she owned. Nobody knew that she had spent the last hour trying not to cry because she had learned long ago that crying in front of the wrong person only gave them another weapon. A few people stared. One woman whispered something to another. Quinn lowered her eyes. She kept walking. By the time darkness began to settle across the plains, her feet were aching badly. The cold was getting worse. She had no coat thick enough for the weather. The wind slipped through her dress and reached her bones. Still she walked. There was an old saying among frontier folk that a person could freeze to death long before the body stopped moving. It meant that sometimes the heart surrendered before the limbs did. Quinn was getting close to that point. She wandered beyond the last houses of the settlement and followed a rough trail without knowing where it led. Her vision blurred. Her breathing became shallow. She stumbled once. Then again. The third time, she fell to her knees. She stayed there. For a while, she simply stared at the dirt beneath her hands. Then she whispered, I can't do this anymore. The words were barely louder than wind. She was not asking anyone. There was no one there. She was simply telling the darkness the truth. A mile or so away stood a modest ranch owned by a man named Samuel Carter. Samuel was 38 years old, though life had already given him the tired eyes of a man twice that age. He lived alone. He had a small cattle operation, a sturdy barn, a few horses, and a house that was plain but carefully maintained. Samuel had never been wealthy, but he had never been careless either. He believed a man's character was measured by what he did when nobody was watching. That evening, he was returning from the far pasture when he noticed something unusual near the trail. At first, he thought it was a fallen blanket. Then it moved. Samuel pulled his horse to a stop. He climbed down. "Ma'am." No answer. He approached carefully. Quinn was curled against the cold ground, one hand still wrapped around the handle of her leather bag. Samuel crouched beside her. Her face was pale. Her lips were trembling. There was dirt on her cheek, and her dress was torn near one sleeve. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyes opened slowly. For a moment, fear flashed through them. She tried to move away. Samuel immediately lifted both hands. "Easy." Quinn stared at him. She had heard that word before, but never from a voice like his. There was no anger in it, no command, only patience. "You'll freeze out here," Samuel said quietly. "I have nowhere to go." Samuel looked toward the distant settlement, then back at her. "All right." Quinn swallowed. "All right what?" "I've got a spare room." She stared at him as if he had spoken another language. Samuel removed his heavy coat and placed it around her shoulders. "You don't have to decide anything tonight," he said. "Just come inside where it's warm." Quinn's eyes filled with tears. She looked away quickly. "I can't pay you. I didn't ask you for money. I can work. I believe you. I won't cause trouble." Samuel's expression softened. "I don't think you will." She looked at him again. That was the first kindness that reached her. Not the coat, not the offer of a room. It was the fact that he had believed her, without demanding proof. Samuel helped her stand. She nearly collapsed again. Without hesitation, he caught her. Quinn stiffened in his arms. Samuel noticed. He immediately loosened his hold. "Sorry." Quinn looked at him with confusion. She had expected impatience. Instead, he had apologized for touching her. Something inside her cracked. She began to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically. The tears simply slipped down her face as though they had been waiting for permission. Samuel said nothing. He merely stood beside her until she was ready to move. That night, Quinn slept beneath 3 blankets in a small room at the back of Samuel's house. For the first time in years, she slept without listening for footsteps outside her door. Samuel left a lamp burning in the hallway. He did not know why. Perhaps he simply understood that some people were afraid of darkness. The next morning, he found her sitting at the kitchen table. She had barely touched the breakfast he prepared. "You should eat," he said. "I'm not very hungry." "Neither am I most mornings." She looked at him. He pushed the plate a little closer. "But I eat anyway." A faint smile appeared on her lips. It was so small that another man might have missed it. Samuel did not. That became the rhythm of their days. He never asked Quinn questions she was not ready to answer. She never demanded anything from him. He gave her space. She gave him help around the house. She washed dishes. She mended shirts. She learned the names of his horses. Samuel taught her how to handle the small garden behind the house. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, something changed. Quinn began to sleep better. The dark circles beneath her eyes faded. She laughed once when Samuel's old horse stubbornly refused to move from the barn door. The sound surprised them both. Samuel looked at her. Quinn covered her mouth. "I'm sorry." "For what?" "Laughing." Samuel frowned. "You don't have to apologize for that." She lowered her hand. "I haven't laughed in a long time." Samuel leaned against the doorway. "Then I reckon we're overdue." That evening, Quinn sat on the porch beside him. The sun was disappearing beyond the plains. For several minutes, neither spoke. Then Quinn said softly, "Why are you kind to me?" Samuel watched the sunset. "Because somebody should have been." She looked at him. He did not look back. Perhaps that was why she believed him. Weeks passed. The first snow arrived early. Samuel repaired the fence while Quinn watched from a porch. She had begun wearing one of his old wool shawls. It was too large for her. Samuel pretended not to notice how much he liked seeing her wrapped in it. Quinn noticed him looking once. "What?" "Nothing." "You were staring." I was thinking. About what? Samuel cleared his throat. That shawl looks better on you. Quinn smiled. That is because I make it look better. Samuel laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh freely. And somehow, she carried the sound with her all day. But healing is rarely a straight road. Some nights Quinn woke screaming. Some nights she could not breathe. Sometimes a raised voice from outside was enough to send her into silence. Samuel never pushed. On those nights, he would sit on the other side of the closed door. He never entered without permission. He simply said, "I'm here." And Quinn would listen. "I'm here." Those 3 words became something precious. Not a promise of love. Not yet. Something more basic. Safety. One winter evening, Quinn finally told him what had happened. She sat near the fireplace with her hands folded tightly in her lap. He said I was worthless. Samuel remained silent. He said no one would want me. His jaw tightened. Quinn continued. He told me that a woman like me should be grateful anyone had married her. Samuel looked into the fire. Quinn. She looked up. That man was wrong. Her eyes filled with tears. You don't know that. I do. How? Because I've watched you work every day since you came here. I've seen you care for animals that aren't yours. I've seen you leave food for the stray dog behind the barn. I've watched you mend my clothes without being asked. I've watched you smile at things that don't deserve a smile. He paused. You're not worthless. Quinn's chin trembled. I believed him. I know. Sometimes I still do. Samuel's voice became softer. Then, until you stop believing him, I'll remind you. She cried then, but these were different tears. They were not the tears of a woman being discarded. They were the tears of a woman finally being seen. Samuel did not touch her. He waited. Quinn eventually reached for his hand. It was the smallest movement. Samuel looked down at their hands. Then, at her. He closed his fingers gently around hers. Nothing more happened. And perhaps that was what made the moment beautiful. There was no rush. No grand declaration. Only 2 lonely people sitting beside a fire while the winter wind pressed against the windows. Months passed. Spring returned. The snow melted from the fields. Quinn's garden began to grow. Her hair grew longer. Color returned to her cheeks. She smiled more often. Samuel began bringing her small things from town. A ribbon. A book. A new pair of gloves. Once, he returned with a blue dress. Quinn stared at it. You bought this for me. Samuel looked uncomfortable. I thought you'd like the color. She touched the fabric. Nobody had bought her something simply because they thought she would like it in a very long time. She looked at him. Thank you. Samuel nodded. You're welcome. She wore the dress the following Sunday. When she stepped into the kitchen, Samuel stopped halfway through pouring coffee. Quinn noticed. Her cheeks turned pink. Is it too much? No. He swallowed. It's just right. She smiled. Samuel looked away. An old man might tell you that love announces itself loudly. But that isn't always true. Sometimes love arrives quietly. Sometimes it looks like a man fixing a broken chair because the woman he cares about likes sitting beside the window. Sometimes it looks like a woman saving the last piece of pie because she knows the man she loves has a sweet tooth. Sometimes it is simply the comfort of hearing another person's footsteps in a hallway and realizing that, for the first time, those footsteps make you feel safe. By summer, Quinn had stopped flinching whenever Samuel entered the room. By autumn, she had begun calling the ranch home. And one evening, while they stood near the fence watching the sunset, Samuel finally said what he had been too careful to say for months. You know you don't have to leave. Quinn looked at him. I know. You could stay. I want to. Samuel breathed out slowly. Quinn, I don't want you staying because you're afraid of being alone. She stepped closer. I'm not afraid anymore. He looked into her eyes. Then why? Her voice was almost a whisper. Because I'm happy here. Samuel's eyes softened. With me? Quinn smiled. Especially with you. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Samuel reached for her hand. This time, she was the one who closed the distance. Their first kiss was gentle, almost hesitant. There was nothing possessive about it. Nothing hurried. It was the kiss of 2 people who had learned that love was not supposed to hurt. When they separated, Quinn rested her forehead against his chest. Samuel wrapped his arms around her. She closed her eyes. For the first time in years, she felt completely safe. And perhaps that was the greatest romance of all. Not that a handsome rancher had rescued a beautiful woman. Not that two lonely people eventually fell in love, but that Quinn, who had once believed she was worthless, slowly discovered that her life had never been finished. She had simply been living in the wrong place. Years later, folks in that part of Wyoming still remembered the woman who arrived at Samuel Carter's ranch during a cold autumn night carrying nothing but a worn leather bag and a heart full of wounds. They remembered how she changed. They remembered how she turned the little ranch house into a home. They remembered how Samuel smiled more after she came. And if you ever ask an old-timer what became of them, he might tell you that Samuel and Quinn grew old together beneath the same wide western sky. He might tell you that she kept the blue dress for years. He might tell you that Samuel never again allowed her to believe she was unwanted. But if that old-timer knows the whole story, he will probably tell you something else. He will tell you that the night Samuel found Quinn beside that lonely trail, he thought he was saving a woman from the cold. He did not understand that she would one day save him from his own loneliness. And that is the strange thing about life. Sometimes the person you think you are rescuing is the very person who was sent to rescue you. Quinn had walked into that ranch believing she had nowhere left to belong. She had been thrown away by a man who could not recognize her worth. But Samuel recognized it. Not because she was beautiful. Not because she could work. Not because she was useful. He recognized it because he looked at her and saw a human being who deserved kindness. And perhaps that was what Quinn had needed all along. Not a hero. Not a rich man. Not someone to promise her the whole world. Just one decent man who would look at her broken heart and say, without asking for anything in return, "You can rest now." And for the first time in her life, Quinn believed him. The years passed. The ranch grew. The garden became larger. Children came later, filling the house with footsteps and laughter. And whenever winter returned and the wind howled across the Wyoming plains, Quinn would sometimes stand by the window and remember that cold evening when she had believed her life was over. Samuel would come up behind her and place his old wool coat around her shoulders. She would lean back against him. "Do you remember?" she would ask. Every day. She would smile. "So do I." Then they would stand together and watch the snow fall. And if there was one lesson hidden in their story, it was this. A cruel person can convince a wounded heart that it has no value. But cruelty is not truth. Sometimes a person's worth becomes visible only after they have escaped the place where they were taught to doubt it. Quinn had once been thrown out into the cold. Years later, she stood inside a warm home surrounded by people who loved her. And she finally understood something she should have known from the beginning. She had never been difficult to love. She had simply been loved by the wrong man. Samuel had not given her back the life she lost. He had helped her build a new one. And that, perhaps, is the kindest miracle the frontier ever witnessed.